The night was heavy with silence, yet inside one small home the air was thick with fear. A mother clutched her two young sons to her chest as boots pounded on the dirt road outside. Torches flickered in the dark, their flames promising not warmth but terror. The boys' small hands dug into their mother's skin, as if holding her tighter could keep the world outside from breaking in. But the world was already at their door. The door crashed open, splinters flying like shrapnel. Men stormed inside, their eyes filled with hatred, their hands dripping with cruelty. They dragged the mother away as her children screamed, their voices lost in the night. She fought, not for herself, but for them. But no struggle could stop what was coming. Dragged into the village square, the woman was tied down while her sons were forced to watch. The men lit torches, and one by one they pressed the fire into her flesh. The smell of burning skin filled the air, her screams slicing through the night like knives. The boys cried until their voices broke, their small bodies shaking as they were held back. The villagers stood around silent, some even smiling. They did not stop the horror, they watched it unfold as if it were theater. The woman's body trembled, her voice hoarse with pain, until at last she collapsed, still alive but broken. And then, to the unthinkable, they pushed the flames closer. For her sons, every second felt like an eternity carved into their memory. They would never forget her eyes, the look of both agony and defiance, as if even through fire she was telling them to survive, to live, to never bow to cruelty. This was no ordinary execution. It was a spectacle of hate, a warning to anyone who dared defy the men in power. But behind that warning was a truth darker than the flames. When cruelty becomes law, even innocence is no shield. And this is where our story begins. To understand how such horror could be carried out in public, we must step back and examine the world that created it. This was not a sudden act of rage. It was the product of years of oppression, control, and the slow poisoning of human hearts by fear and ideology. In many ancient and medieval societies, punishment was not only about justice, it was about display. The body became a stage where rulers proved their power. Torture was a tool, not just to punish one individual, but to send a message to the masses. When a person was burned, whipped, or mutilated, the punishment was not meant only for them, it was meant for everyone watching. Religious zeal, political paranoia, and personal vendettas often blended into a dangerous cocktail of cruelty. Women in particular were vulnerable. Branded as witches, rebels, or disobedient wives, they could be accused with little proof and condemned with little mercy. Once marked, their fate was sealed. In the case of the mother burned alive before her sons, the charge against her was not about a crime she committed. It was about defiance. She had dared to speak against those in power, dared to question decisions that starved her people, dared to resist when soldiers took what little she had. Her resistance, however small, was enough to make her an example. Her sons, still children, were forced to attend her punishment not by accident, but by design. To the executioners, breaking her was not enough. They needed to break her family. By forcing her children to witness her suffering, they hoped to shatter the next generation's will to resist. This was a world where human life was cheap, where public executions were considered entertainment, and where pain was currency used by the powerful to buy obedience. But within that darkness, there is something else, something even those who lit the flames did not expect. Because sometimes, when children are forced to watch horror, they do not break. They harden, they remember, and they carry that memory forward like a fire of their own. The story of this mother and her sons is not only one of cruelty, it is one of legacy. Her screams did not vanish into the night. They stayed alive in the hearts of her children, shaping their destiny, and through them, changing the course of history. The night of the execution was only the beginning. For the two young boys, life was split in two, the time before their mother was burned and the time after. At first, silence followed them. Villagers avoided their eyes, ashamed or afraid. Some whispered that the boys were cursed, marked forever by the sins of their mother. Others pitied them, but pity did not feed hungry mouths. They were left with nothing, orphans, stripped of home, stripped of family, living only with the memory of screams. But children are resilient in ways adults cannot imagine. The older boy became fiercely protective of his younger brother. When others tried to humiliate them, he stood tall, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with the same fire he had seen that night. The younger one, though smaller, carried inside him a quiet resolve. Both boys lived with one goal, to survive, because to give up would mean their mother's suffering was in vain. Over the years, the story of what happened to their mother spread. Some told it as a warning, don't cross those in power or you will share her fate. But others told it differently, whispering that her defiance was noble, that even in fire she had not begged, that her spirit lived on in her children. As the boys grew older, the memory of that night hardened into something sharper. They did not forget the laughter of the men who held the torches, the silence of the neighbors who turned away, the cruelty of those who forced them to watch. Each detail etched into their minds like scars. And those scars became their strength. When at last they became men, the two brothers were no longer helpless children. They began to organize quietly, gathering others who had suffered similar losses, others who had buried their loved ones under the weight of tyranny. And soon, the same rulers who had burned their mother alive would find themselves hunted, not by armies, but by memories too strong to kill. The fire, meant to break them, instead lit the spark of rebellion. And while we may never know every exact detail of how the brothers fought back, one truth remains clear. Cruelty can silence a voice, but it cannot silence an idea. The memory of a mother's suffering became the weapon her sons wielded against those who had once held all the power. Imagine the screams of your mother carved into your memory, every night replaying like a broken record. Imagine being a child and seeing her skin blister under flame, while the crowd watched in silence. That trauma is not a wound that heals. It is a fire that either consumes you or fuels you. For the brothers, it fueled them. They carried her eyes in their dreams, her voice in their hearts. They carried the guilt of not being able to save her, the helplessness of standing frozen while her body burned. But they also carried her courage, the way she lifted her head even as the flames tore her apart. What the rulers intended as a warning became instead a source of strength. The boys grew up knowing the cost of silence. They knew that looking away only gives cruelty more power. And so, when they stood against the same men years later, they did not do it for revenge alone. They did it for every child forced to watch their mother suffer, for every family torn apart by tyranny, for every innocent life burned to ash in the name of control. Their story is not just a story of pain, it is a story of defiance. And that defiance is what makes it unforgettable. The story of the mother who was burned alive before her sons is not only about cruelty, it is about legacy. Cruelty may break bodies, but courage outlives fire. Her sons carried her suffering, but more importantly, they carried her strength. We live in a world today far removed from burning torches in the village square, yet cruelty still exists. It may not always wear the same mask, but it thrives in silence, in indifference, in the moments when people look away. That is why stories like this matter, because they remind us of the cost of silence and the power of memory. The men who burned her thought they had erased her, but they were wrong. She lived on in her children, in their defiance, in every whispered story that refused to let her be forgotten. And today, by remembering her, we become part of that chain, ensuring that cruelty never wins the final word. So the lesson is this: when faced with cruelty, we must not look away. We must not be silent, because silence is the soil where tyranny grows. But courage, the courage of a mother in flames, the courage of sons who survived, is the fire that keeps hope alive. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more untold stories of dark history. Because history is not only about kings and empires, it is about ordinary people who endured extraordinary pain and whose stories still have the power to change us.